Good afternoon, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here to this webinar organized by the People's Rights Group to discuss the issue of forced cremations of COVID-19 victims and the continued violation of minority rights by the Sri Lankan authorities. We are live on Facebook, and the webinar will be published on YouTube once it's over. I'm sure we can all agree that the minority communities the world over have been the hardest hit by the pandemic due to the structural inequalities they face. And this is no different to the Muslim community and the minority community of Sri Lanka, many of whom live in crowded housing, which has been found to increase the chances of the spread of COVID-19. And they have low-paid jobs, which put them in the firing line of the virus. And it is this situation and this virus that the Sri Lankan government has weaponized as a vehicle to mete out a law that is Islamophobic, an extreme curtailment of minority rights, human rights, the right to life, and the right to practice one's religious freedom. Now, the forced cremation policy is part of the Sri Lankan government's wide-ranging portfolio that covers decades long of policies and practices that serve the sole purpose of undermining and stifling minority communities. And this portfolio continues to expand and continues to go unchecked. And it is with this backdrop that the People's Rights Group bring you this webinar with a very distinguished panel of speakers who will each provide their insight into the matter. But before we begin, I do want to take a moment to introduce the People's Rights Group. People's Rights Group is a rights-based advocacy lobbying group based in the UK with the purpose of addressing issues and supporting victims of human rights violations. PRG, as we are known in our abbreviation, pays special attention to the rising trend of human rights violations against minorities and vulnerable groups. We also work to disseminate resources on minority rights issues. We have something that we would like to share with you. It is a documentary, a snippet of our 23-minute long documentary, which provides a visual take on the plight of the Muslim and minority communities' fight for the last rights of their loved ones. It is a collation of news bites, along with commentary by journalist Hazim Nazir, to whom we extend our gratitude for her assistance in making this documentary. I won't delve further, but I do want to put our trigger warning for distressing content. And this documentary will be available on our website as well as YouTube link. So yes, over to showing the documentary. Thank you.
Over the past decade, Muslims in Sri Lanka have been subjected to various forms of violence.
Look at the Muslims. I mean, what are they asking for? They're asking for their last rights.
The Sri Lankan government has made cremation compulsory for all COVID-19 related deaths, leaving many Muslims and Christians in the country unable to fulfill their religious rights of burying the dead.
அநியாயத்துக்கு கொரோனான்னு சொல்லி போட்டு மாமாவை ஞாயிற்றுக்கிழமை திங்கக்கிழமை பின்னியார ஞாயிற்றுக்கிழமை இரவு மாமாவை 6:30 மணிக்கு 7 மணிக்கு இடையில கொண்டு போய் எரிச்சிட்டாங்க.
කොරෝනාවෙන් මරණයක් සිදු වෙනකොට ඒ අදාළ පාර්ශවවල කැමැත්ත අකමැත්ත අනුව භූමි දානය කරන්න පුළුවන් ආදාහනය කරන්න පුළුවන්.
இது 24 மணிக்குள்ளால யார் மெதுக்கொள்ளாட்டி எங்கட வேலையை நாங்கள் பற்ற வச்சு போடுறதுக்கு
කවුරු හරි අන්තවාදී අපේ කියන බෞද්ධයින් කියලා කියා ගන්න අයගේ මුස්ලිම් විරෝධය නිසා මේ අන්තවාදී අදහස් අනුව මේ අයගෙන් මේ අවස්ථාව පාවිච්චි කරගෙන පරිගන්නවා කියන
රෝගෙන් මේ යන පුද්ගලයන්ගේ මූර්ත දේහ ආදාහනය කළ යුතු බවයි.
ආදාහනයයි දෙගොල්ලන්ටම කරගන්නට පුළුවන් කියලා තමන්ගේ කැමැත්ත අනුව.
සහිත බවට වාර්තා 4ක් නිකුත් වෙලා තිබ්බා. නමුත් මෙම වාර්තා 4 අපි නැවත පරීක්ෂා කරා.
අධිකරි ජනාධිපතිතුමනි ඔබතුමා මැදිහත් වෙලා මෙරට හැම මිනිස්සයාටම නීතිය ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න.
After Supreme Court hearing 2 days argument dismissed the case saying there is no reason to proceed.
ඡන්දය දුන්නේ ගෝඨාභය රාජපක්ෂ මැතිතුමාට. මිසෝ ඡන්දය දුන්නේ මේ රජයට. අවසාන තීන්දුව ගෝඨාභය රාජපක්ෂ මැතිතුමාත් රජයත් ගත යුතුයි. We need justice.
The Prime Minister of Sri Lanka has asked the authorities to find a suitable land to bury Muslim coronavirus victims. However, the Sri Lankan Health Expert Committee suggests that the burial of coronavirus victims shall not be permitted.
Decision by the Sri Lankan to mandate cremation for all those deceased due to COVID.
Forcing the cremation of the bodies of people who have died from COVID-19.
More recently, the Sri Lankan government has introduced forced cremation for COVID-19 victims, a policy that has absolutely no basis in science.
Implement the one country, one law policy.
Called expert committee, which is full of people who are pseudo-scientists.
Tamil and Muslim minorities are being excluded by divisive and discriminatory rhetoric, including from the highest state officials. The policy of forced cremation of COVID-19 victims has caused pain and distress to the minority Muslim and Christian communities.
But interestingly, the burial ban drama, which started off at the end of March 2020, citing pseudo-scientific basis, ended a year later unceremoniously. The world needs to ask now, should not the government of Sri Lanka not be held to account for enacting this tragicomedy, which exposed the true face of racism of the establishment in the process? To respect the legitimate concerns of the people, irrespective of racial or religious differences. Failure to do so fails humanity as a whole.
So that was our short introduction to the documentary, which, like I said, will be available on our website and also our YouTube channel. So please do look out for a link in the chat box. Now, today is also the launch of our report on the forced cremation issue. And yes, so it's the chat has now got the link for the documentary. And I just want to give a little introduction to our report as well before I hand it over to the speakers who are very patiently waiting. So in response to the grave violations of minority rights that has been taking place in Sri Lanka since and no doubt before the COVID-19 pandemic, we have, so we've compiled a detailed report that seeks to outline a trajectory of how the forced cremation policy has come about, how the local authorities implemented it, and the actions taken by minority communities on the ground to combat this cremation-only policy, despite the WHO guidelines, which stated very clearly the possibility for both the safe burial and the cremation of COVID-19 victims. And this report is an effort to put on record that the actions of the Sri Lankan government in refusing minority communities their last rites is not something to be brushed under the carpet when the world returns to some sense of normality, or actions that can go without the perpetrators being brought to account. It puts forth primary evidence that was collected by PRG that shows direct or potential human rights violations against minorities and covers the period 27th of January to the 22nd of February. And our methodology is essentially a desk review, as, like I've said, primary data collection by our disseminations manager, Bazil Rahman, and with the assistance of Shireen Sarur, who gave us a lot of facts on the ground. And our report covers a history of the violence in Sri Lanka, as well as the national, international lobbying efforts, state-sanctioned discrimination of minority communities, and a legal analysis of the policy. And this report was authored by Megara Tegal, who is a researcher in gender and minority rights who, due to diary constraints, couldn't be with us here today. We sincerely hope that this report acts as a point of reference. We can only hope that we have done justice to give a voice to Sri Lanka's minority communities that continue to be at the mercy of an Islamophobic, nationalistic, and racist government. Thank you very much to all of you. Now we are going to go on to our speakers and hear from them and what they have to say. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Shireen Sarur, who is an award-winning human rights activist. She is the co-founder of the Mannar Women's Development Federation and the Women's Network Action in Sri Lanka. And as a human rights activist, she has advocated for the challenges faced by Muslims and Tamil minorities. For the next 8 minutes, Shireen will be speaking on 1 year of forced cremations, 1 year of struggle for rights. Where are we today? Shireen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Samia. I would first talk about a little bit about current situation in Sri Lanka with regard to the minorities, and then I'll go into the Muslim community, okay? Sri Lanka is again facing human rights crisis. Attacks on human rights defenders and ethnic and religious minorities are on the rise. And an authoritarian government is solidifying power using COVID-19 pandemic as a cover. Movements towards reconciliation and transitional justice after Sri Lanka's civil war have stagnated. At this period of multiple vulnerabilities, it is critical that Sri Lankan government remain engaged with the international community and the UN Human Rights Council. Since the new government coming to power in 2019, human rights defenders, journalists, and those seeking to investigate and prosecute violations during the civil war have been systematically targeted. The Presidential Secretariat is consolidating power over civil society by placing transitional justice activists under surveillance, including war-affected women searching for relatives of disappeared during the war. Women's groups and minority rights groups, civil society have been placed under surveillance. Organizations' bank accounts have been tapped and activists have been requested to report to Criminal Investigation Unit and Financial Investigation Unit to explain their funding sources. And an order in the official gazette gives the Defense Ministry control over the police and civil intelligence services, immigration and immigration services, civic institutions, including non-governmental organizations, telecommunication and media. These recent efforts are exactly how this government wants to control freedom of expression, movements, dissent, and activism. A much regressive law to control all civil society organizations is in the making. Through military control, minorities and civil society organizations are intimidated to prevent engagement with the international community. Land grabbed by the military has yet to be returned, and more lands have been grabbed and the Defense Ministry has colluded with Buddhist monks to encroach land belonging to minority communities under the pretext of preserving religious sites. On May 15, 2020, while the country was under COVID lockdown, Defense Secretary acted under President's instruction to order the commander of the Navy to immediately establish a naval contingent to protect the Buddhist Mudu Mahavihara temple and its land. This order was widely viewed as a move to evict Muslims and Tamils in the area of Pothuvil East. This is in the Eastern Province. We have also witnessed a trend in recent times, the unearthing of Buddhist artifacts in and around ancient Hindu temples, and devotees are being prevented from performing, worshipping, and religious practices from ancient Hindu temples. In Batiklo, predominantly Tamils live there. Cattle farmers are denied of their grazing land. Singular farmers have been brought by the government to occupy such land and create tension. In January, 3 such cattle owners have been abducted by singular settlers. In the north, 3 islands of Jaffna have been given for electricity generation for Chinese companies without a single consultation with communities living there. Most recently, in an attempt to drive out war-affected returning population, government decided to use parts of cattle grazing land in a small island called Iranathivu as a burial ground for Muslim community that was denied of their burial rights for COVID deceased. These are only few examples I can give you as how government is depriving minorities of their rights while pitting the communities against each other for mere political gain. State counterterrorism effort has been used increasingly targeting Muslims and Tamils. One such example is imprisonment of lawyer Hijaz Hizbullah, a well-known advocate for rule of law. Over a period of 10 months, he was detained under PTA and was subject to trial by media, alleging that he was involved in Easter bombing. Hizbullah is now charged under PTA. After Easter attacks in April 2019, hundreds of Muslims were arrested under PTA and ICCPR Act on suspicion of even possessing Arabic script and translation of Quran. The current government has continued such arrest. On May 16, 2020, the Criminal Investigation Unit arrested a young poet, Anaf Jassim, who persuaded non-violence through his poem, and to date he is not charged but kept in poor detention facilities where he is being bitten by rats. At least 48 Tamils and Muslims have been detained under PTA in the last year, especially during COVID lockdown, with charges yet to be filed. There are 8 Muslim women and 3 Muslim infants in that slot. While the PTA and ICCPR are weaponized against minorities and dissents, hate-mongering Buddhist monks and media channels openly spread rumors and fake news about Muslim community and other minorities. Sri Lanka's PTA has long been, Prevention of Terrorism Act, has long been criticized for failing to meet international standards. The previous administration attempted to repeal and replace it with proposed Counter-Terrorism Act on January 2nd, 2020, with Rajapaksa once more in power. His cabinet withdrew the CTA bill, leaving the PTA in place. By withdrawing CTA bill, Sri Lanka is failing on the pledge it made to international community, particularly Human Rights Council and European Union. Since the end of the war 2009, Muslims have increasingly become target of hatred, state-sponsored injustice and violence. There were violent attacks against halal certification, the attire of the Muslim women, Muslim houses, businesses, properties, places of worship, and Muslim religious education. Even the pandemic was used to spread hate against Muslim community. Muslims were accused of having introduced and carriers of the virus. Powerful media house aligned to the government promoted stories that portrayed Muslims as unpatriotic and undisciplined. TV program focused predominantly on Muslim areas under lockdown and Muslims being tested positive and quarantined. Not a single step has been taken to counter these false reports and hate mongering on the Muslim community by head of the state. Indeed, anti-Muslim campaign was central to President Rajapaksa's electoral campaign last November, and his administration has ramped up similar sentiment during the parliament election, and now the provincial council election being talked about. We see the same trend being replayed. Coronavirus, time up, is it?
Yes, I'm sorry, Shireen.
Let me finish this.
You can wrap up.
Okay, a conservative estimate is that more than 300 Muslims suspected of dying of COVID virus have been forcibly cremated against wishes of the family, and they still demand for justice and need healing and closure. Interestingly, on the day the government was to relax the ban on burial, Justice Minister presented a cabinet memorandum to ban wearing hijab in public places for security reasons. This is when we are all wearing masks. This looks like bartering rights to calm down extreme Buddhist monks. Allowing burial of COVID-19 victims is no means an indicator that everything is back to normal. The mindset of the government was revealed by 2 state ministers who have articulated very openly that based on anything the expert recommend, the government will revert to cremation only policy. To date, about 40 Muslim janazas have been buried in Ottamavadi, only designated burial location for entire country. We have had consultation with people who were placed under lockdown recently. It revealed that many towns that came under prolonged lockdown are inhabited mostly by Muslims. Some such lockdown areas were under lockdown 6 to 8 weeks under military confinement, and they were denied access to essential items like medicine, leading to increased suffering and deaths within the Muslim community. Many Muslims have been taken to quarantine center at camps that are run by military. We receive over 22 calls from different such camps complaining of overcrowding and poor hygienic condition, leading to cross-spreading of COVID. Still reeling from the trauma that the Muslim community underwent, they are fearful to even access the health facilities, including COVID vaccine. In short, This is an extremely difficult time for minority rights in Sri Lanka. Ethno-nationalism mixed with Buddhization of the country, combined with militarization, Tamils and Muslims and other minorities are extremely threatened. The government has used the current pandemic to further fracture ethnic community for political gain. The international community must stand guard to safeguard minority rights. A resolution on accountability and access to truth and justice is a must, apart from activating the prevention mandate of High Commissioner. And Sri Lanka should report to Human Rights Council every 6 months. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shireen. I'm very sorry to have to ask you to cut that short. That was incredibly interesting and so important to hear what you had to share. Thank you so much again. I will swiftly move on to our second speaker, Dr. Gihan Gunatilaka, who is a lawyer specializing in Sri Lankan law, international rights law, human rights law, with a special focus on freedom of expression, religious liberty, and countering violent extremism. Dr. Gihan is also a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School and a founding partner at Lex AG, Colombo-based law firm specializing in corporate, commercial, and intellectual property law. Dr. Gihan, for the next 8 minutes, you will be speaking on the forced cremations in the context of a pattern of broader human rights violations against minorities. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for that kind introduction, and of course the invitation to speak at this event. So in my short presentation, I want to locate the forced cremation issue within the broader landscape of human rights violations against minorities in Sri Lanka. And I'm going to then offer some brief observations on how the means of oppression have evolved in Sri Lanka, and why institutional reform is so important to meeting this challenge. So first of all, is the forced cremation policy an isolated event or part of a broader pattern? That's the first question to really ask. So I think the ban on burials cannot be assessed in a vacuum. It is connected to a long list of other restrictions on fundamental freedoms, and Shreen has already mentioned some of these problems, and I just want to reiterate the point. So this is a practice which is considered to be detrimental to the dominant culture or the interests of the majority. So forced cremation comes at a time where the prohibition of Muslim attire or certain types of attire is under discussion. Muslim lawyers are being arbitrarily arrested and detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Tamil victim memorials and memorialization in public spaces are being challenged by state actors. Minority protests, peaceful protests, are being systematically suppressed. So the fact remains that there is a certain type of deep and entrenched prejudice towards minorities in Sri Lanka, and this prejudice is often cultivated and opportunistically deployed by political actors across the political spectrum. And I would call forced cremation really just another cog in this wheel, this broader wheel of discrimination in Sri Lanka. Now let's focus a little bit on the forced cremation policy. So a number of religious groups, including Muslims and Christians, firmly believe that the deceased should be buried and not cremated. It is in fact, I think, widely believed that other forms of disposal, including cremation, are contrary to religious teaching and can even jeopardize the prospects of the afterlife or of the deceased concerned. But until recently, burial of COVID-19 victims, even those just suspected of having died of COVID-19, was banned in Sri Lanka. And cremation was the only permitted means of disposing a body. Now, of course, the ordinary means of disposing the dead amongst the majority Buddhist community in the country is in fact cremation. So immediately there was a question about good faith. And the question was raised particularly by the Muslim community. Was it really a scientific decision, a science-based policy, or was it merely a means of punishing a minority and appeasing a majority? So initially the policy was defended on the grounds of public health. But we soon discovered that the policy was entirely in bad faith and lacked a scientific basis. And when it was finally withdrawn just recently, it was done overnight and in a context of increasing international pressure. So the non-scientific and purely political basis for the policy was further revealed. So in essence, I think it's fair to say that this policy was exposed as just a means of appeasing majoritarian sentiment in Sri Lanka and oppressing a minority. It served no other ostensible purpose. So this brings me to a separate point about the means of oppression, particularly targeting minorities, and how these means have evolved in Sri Lanka. Now, a decade ago, we had become accustomed in Sri Lanka to extra legal means of oppression. So persons, particularly from minority communities, and those even from the majority community that were dissenters, were assaulted, they were abducted and disappeared, they were extrajudicially killed. These were the standard means through which oppression was meted out. But today the situation has evolved. We now see what I like to call intra-legal, and I use this term cautiously because I don't want to call it just legal means of oppression. It's within the legal domain, intra-legal means of oppression have emerged. The law has become the means by which the state oppresses minorities. Today we see more use of so-called legal means to arrest people, to detain them, to prosecute and convict them of all kinds of offenses. And make no mistake, the problem is not just with the text of the law. Yes, on the one hand, we have draconian laws like the Prevention of Terrorism Act that Shreen referred to, which are by design, they're designed to be abused. But we also, on the other hand, have laws such as the ICCPR Act, which is actually modeled on international standards. And this law is also being used routinely to oppress people. Shreen quite rightly pointed to the emblematic case of Hijaz Hizbullah. The state intends to charge him both under the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and the ICCPR Act. And for me, this is really an emblematic case on many fronts. It demonstrates the willingness of the state not only to target minority communities in general, but also to target their most vocal advocates. And it also shows how the worst kinds of laws, like the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, can be used alongside the so-called model laws, such as the ICCPR Act, to oppress minorities. So this is the age of intra-legal oppression in Sri Lanka. And I think it's important for us to understand this evolution. So how do we confront this crisis? I think that the answer lies in institutional reform. There's a type of sophistication that comes with this shift from the extra-legal to the intra-legal. Intra-legal oppression can have a veneer of legitimacy. And it is harder to dismantle, particularly if institutions within law enforcement and the judicial system are weak. We then end up with oppression that enjoys a type of legitimacy that the law has. And institutional actors play their part in sanitizing oppression. And to address this problem, I think we need independent institutions. So I'll end with this thought. I think minorities in Sri Lanka are going to constantly face discriminatory policies designed to appease majoritarian sentiment as long as we have institutional problems. So until we fix our institutions, we're going to keep confronting this problem. And I don't mean institutional reform is a sufficient solution. I think cultural transformation, which is often a tougher, longer-term project, is equally, if not more important. But I do think institutional reform is a necessary part of the solution. So the energies of civil society and change agents must go into institutional reform if we're serious about ending this pattern of oppression of minorities in Sri Lanka. And I'll pause there. Thanks very much.
Very much for that very interesting and insightful take on the current issue and moving forward. Before I go into our third and final speaker, I do want to encourage our participants to please drop your questions in the Q&A feature so that we can answer these with the guests during our Q&A session. Now I would like to introduce our third speaker, Jim McDonald, who is the Sri Lanka country specialist for Amnesty International USA. Jim has been working with Amnesty International since 1990, has been campaigning for the minority communities of Sri Lanka for many years, ranging from campaigns like the Sri Lanka's Killing Field. And very recently, Jim has been vocal in bringing the issue of forced cremation to international attention, and we are very happy to have you here, Jim. Over to you. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mention Jim will be speaking for the next 8 minutes on have international accountability measures failed and what next for Sri Lanka. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Samia. I've been asked, as she said, to speak on the topic of international accountability measures failed, what next for Sri Lanka. I actually have a problem with this topic. How can we decide whether or not international accountability measures have failed or not on Sri Lanka when they haven't been tried in the first place? I will nevertheless try to address efforts for accountability for human rights violations in Sri Lanka on an international level over recent years. Successive governments in Sri Lanka have over the decades committed human rights abuses against individuals from all communities in the country, both against the Muslim and Tamil minorities, as well as those from the Sinhalese majority community. These have occurred in the context of armed conflict, including both the 26-year war with the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam and also the insurrection in the late 1980s by the JVP, a Sinhalese opposition group. They have also occurred outside armed conflict, with torture and police custody often being used in ordinary criminal cases. And as we've heard from the other speakers, human rights violations have continued since the end of the war with the Tigers in 2009, with the persecution of the Muslim minority, as well as arbitrary detention, torture, and enforced disappearances of those deemed to be opponents of the government, whether they are Muslim, Tamil, or Sinhalese. The final bloody months of the war with the Tigers resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of Tamil civilians. International efforts towards accountability since the end of the war have occurred in reaction to this bloodbath. But there also were thousands of other victims from earlier periods, including 30 to 60,000 estimated forced disappearances during the JVP insurrection, as well as thousands of Tamil and Muslim victims during the earlier years of the war with the Tigers. It must also be noted that the Tigers, the JVP, and the Indian Peacekeeping Force, while the IPKF was on the island, were themselves guilty of gross human rights abuses. An impartial effort for accountability must include accountability for all human rights abuses, no matter which actor committed them. Since the end of the war with the Tigers in 2009, the UN Human Rights Council has adopted 7 resolutions on Sri Lanka. The first resolution came shortly after the end of the war and was drafted by the Sri Lankan government. Not surprisingly, it congratulated the government on its conduct of the war. Subsequent resolutions in 2012 and 2013 adopted by the Council called on Sri Lanka to implement its promises towards a domestic effort towards accountability, a promise made by then President Mahinda Rajapaksa shortly after the end of the war. With the government's failure to live up to its promise, the Council in 2014 adopted a resolution authorizing an investigation by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights into war crimes and other violations of international humanitarian law. The investigation resulted in a report in 2015, which found credible allegations that war crimes and human rights violations had been committed by both the government and the Tigers. Shortly after the High Commissioner's report was issued in September 2015, the Human Rights Council passed another resolution, Resolution 30/1, on Sri Lanka. This time, the resolution was co-sponsored by the Sri Lankan government. The new government in Sri Lanka at that time had just come to power that year and had ousted the Rajapaksa regime, which had prosecuted the end of the war. Resolution 30/1 promised that the Sri Lankan government would set up 4 transitional justice mechanisms: an office on missing persons, an office to provide reparations to victims of human rights abuses and their families, a truth commission, and a judicial mechanism with international participation to investigate allegations of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Resolution 30/1 also required that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights report back to the Council to assess the Sri Lankan government's implementation of its commitments under Resolution 30/1. During the next 4 years, The Sri Lankan government did take some limited steps to comply with 30/1. After much delay, it set up an office on missing persons and an office for reparations. But nothing was done to establish a truth commission or the judicial mechanism with international participation. In 2017 and then in 2019, the Human Rights Council heard reports from the High Commissioner and excuses from the Sri Lankan government. Each time, the Council passed another resolution extending the deadline for the Sri Lankan government to fulfill its commitments by another 2 years. The Human Rights Council is currently meeting now in Geneva. Sri Lanka is on its agenda since the latest resolution passed in 2019 is now due to expire. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has issued a damning report on the current government's actions to regress from the prior government's human rights commitments. The current government has stated that it has withdrawn from Resolution 30/1. The government promises that a domestic mechanism will take care of concerns about justice and accountability. But we have been here before many times. Time and again, in response to international pressure on human rights, the Sri Lankan government has pointed to its domestic efforts, often through the creation of special commissions of inquiry. But these have not been genuine processes of accountability. They have been delaying tactics. In 2009, Amnesty International published a report entitled 20 Years of Make-Believe, Sri Lanka's Commissions of Inquiry. The Sri Lankan government's record since 2009 has been consistent with the earlier experiences documented in Amnesty's 2009 report. Commissions created, recommendations issued by commissions, recommendations ignored by the government. Although the Office on Missing Persons and the Office for Reparations have done some valuable work since they were established, their future under the new government is unclear, and their work is only part of an answer for accountability. The war criminals and other human rights violators remain at large and unpunished. Indeed, some of them occupy positions of power. The Human Rights Council is expected to consider another resolution on Sri Lanka before its current session ends on March 23rd. The very limited progress we have seen since 2015 has been in the context of continued scrutiny of Sri Lanka's human rights efforts by the Human Rights Council. It is essential that the Council pass another resolution now so that Sri Lanka remains on its agenda and under scrutiny. The resolution should establish a robust mechanism for the High Commissioner to continue monitoring and reporting on human rights in Sri Lanka and to collect and preserve evidence of human rights violations for possible future prosecutions. If the Human Rights Council does not step up and address the defiance by the current Sri Lankan government towards efforts for accountability, the Council will fail the people of Sri Lanka. It will also send a very troubling sign to all other governments and opposition groups that the way to evade accountability is to simply ignore and defy the international community. That is not the future any of us want to see. The Human Rights Council must fulfill its role and adopt a strong resolution on Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that incredible insight. So we have had a flurry of questions and activity, and the guests have been quite busy typing some of them, but there are some questions that I think will be interesting to hear live. And one of them is that, is it likely that the Muslim community will now wind down as they have sort of achieved their goals, or due to fear or fatigue, how can they be kept involved in the fight for rights? Shireen, there is in your name is in brackets. I'm assuming it is for you. So would you like to maybe in 2 minutes, please tackle that question?
So it's, the burial situation is not only the situation that Muslim community started looking at it, ask international community's intervention, because in the last, immediately after the end of the war, the escalation of violence against Muslims, many of us have been in the Geneva Circle, asking, reiterating that the Muslim community also need to be protected. So in that context, we expect Sri Lankan Muslims to be engaged in the whole process because burial is part of the total kind of kind of erosion of minority rights in the country, and it's very structural. So I think for political reason, maybe Sri Lankan politicians might go with the Sri Lankan government, but people on the ground, what I hear from them, they really want international accountability. Besides, over 300 odd Muslims have been unfairly cremated, and they need justice. And some of them have gone to international ICCPR under ICCPR protocol mechanism. So victims really want some form of accountability, and it will continue.
Thank you for that very concise but holistic answer. I hope that has answered the question for for the person that has posted it. There is another question here from Lukman Harith, and it's directed to Dr. Gihan and or Jim. And it says, despite global condemnation and sound scientific rationale, Sri Lankan government continued regardless, with Sri Lanka's UNHRC rep insulting global intelligence by saying there was no such forced cremation policy. How can such nations which implement their institutionalized racism agenda be held to account more effectively under international law, especially when they rely on rogue superpowers to justify their actions for economic reasons? Jim, would you like to go first?
Sure. It's how can they be held accountable? The action that's been going on has been at the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, because that is not a body at the UN that is subject to the superpowers veto that the 5 permanent members have over the Security Council. So that is why we've seen most of the action happening at the UN Human Rights Council. The other thing that could be done is individual states could exercise universal jurisdiction. We've seen this in a number of cases, often against members of the Tigers, frankly, in the West. There have been prosecutions of people who've been found to be resident there. That is not something that would be subject to the geopolitical problems you have with trying to get action done by the Security Council. So Gahan may have other suggestions as well.
I mean, it's difficult to answer that question without referring to the nature of the Sri Lankan state. I'm always reticent about pointing a finger to a particular government and saying this government is worse than that government, and it's that governmental actors are really to blame. I think the very nature of the Sri Lankan state needs to be investigated more closely, and I think the nature of the state over the years since independence has been shaped by majoritarian sentiment, and what we have is a fundamentally majoritarian state. And then you have political actors that know how to opportunistically wield that sentiment. And even the forced cremation policy is ultimately, driven by this need to appease majoritarian sentiment. Make no mistake, it did have popular support. There were people in Sri Lanka, and I would say a significant segment of the majority community supported this policy, and they supported it for various reasons. Some of it was just blatant antagonism towards the Muslim community. And I think what we see here is a situation where actors are able to understand that and then seize that opportunity for political gain. And if not for international pressure, I believe that the policy would still be in effect today. So that really shows why international pressure is so important, even though there are limits to international intervention. And I don't think we can put all our eggs in that basket. I think some of the changes that are prompted through international pressure are not always sustainable because it lacks local support. But in these situations, some respite can be secured through international pressure. And this particular instance really proves that point. Because for so long, when the government had all the opportunities to withdraw the policy on scientific grounds, on human rights grounds, on just compassionate grounds, on even certain political grounds, because there was some opposition even within the government towards this policy. Some of the government ministers were opposed to it. They had so many opportunities and they still stubbornly held on to the policy. And it was only when there was international pressure that the government finally withdrew the policy. So it's a testament to sometimes the need for actors to look to international partners to promote and protect human rights.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you very much, Dr. Gihan, for that very thorough answer. There are a couple of more questions, and there is one here, particularly to Jim, and it's come through from Mrs. Zarina Aziz, and it says, during the informal last week, Sri Lanka is asking the core group that OP8 of the draft 1 to be completely removed as the claim of burial of COVID-19 disease for Muslim community does not exist in Sri Lanka anymore. What is your opinion? Jim, would you like to quickly, in a minute or so, please tackle that?
To the extent that 01 is referring to a factual situation that's no longer the case, of course, it's hard to argue against having a resolution that's current. That doesn't mean we should weaken the resolution in any sense. So I wouldn't support anything that would seem to undermine the reality of the violations the Sri Lankan government has caused.
Thank you, Jim. I do believe that
paragraph will stay intact. It won't. It will not be removed. Operational paragraph 8 will be there. We have an assurance from the drafters, and also operational paragraph 7 talks about the Muslim community. So therefore, it's we as Muslims who articulated with the victims have very specifically asked international community to keep operational paragraph 8. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen. There is one final question, which is it possible to stand for justice in this climate of an irrationally acting government in Sri Lanka without international communities' intervention? And did any action take place for compensation to forced cremation? I think Shireen might be best placed to answer that. And if anyone else wants to contribute, please do.
That's one of the things that we are articulating, and because we have exhausted the local mechanism, I myself went to Supreme Court, and my case with the victims were thrown out. Even though one judge dissented, they didn't even give explanation. There are writ application, there are cases filed in magistrate court, district court, all courts that we have filed. We have gone to all the human rights mechanisms that are possible in the country. There is no explanation whatsoever why they did this. And now we seek international community to give some form of justice to the families who suffered of this nightmare, because this nightmare is not gone, because this nightmare is haunting the entire Muslim community, and we are kept on our toes, because anytime government can revise the gazette and bring in the cremation policy, because they are talking about one country, one law in this country, and a Buddhist country. So that's why it's very important that international community keep an eye on what happened in Sri Lanka with regard to forced cremation and accountability for those families that suffered. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shireen, for answering that question. So a lot of the answers have been typed by the speakers. So thank you to all of you for putting your efforts into that. There is a very final question, and I think I can take that. Fazlur Rahman thanks the presenters and says the international community and the UN specifically, we know that they have been able to score a few minor results every now and then. But when it comes to major issues, or where major players like the US, UK, EU, China backing up the oppressors, there is very little success so far. Are we realistically to expect any moral-based justice under the current world order? Does anybody want to tackle that question, Dr. Gihan?
Yeah, I'm happy to give some thoughts on that. Well, I think I share the sort of cynicism of the question, inherent in the question. And I think a lot of international fora, which involve state actors or member states, are governed by politics and geopolitics. And the Human Rights Council is no different. And human rights advocates need to understand that there is a political economy that operates both in the background and the foreground. When it comes to issues in Sri Lanka, we've encountered that. And I think, as I said before, putting all our eggs in that basket of the international intervention is never going to be sustainable, because these fora are not going to deliver long, sustainable reform to a country which has not yet brought its majority community alongside these demands. So there's no buy-in within the majority community for a lot of these reforms. In that context, you're never going to be able to really effect long-term, deep reforms through international intervention of this nature. But that's not to say that these interventions are not important. I think when it comes to respite, when it comes to ensuring that there's some scrutiny in terms of governmental policy, and really pressurizing the government to at least do the small things, like changing policies when it comes to forced cremation, releasing human rights advocates. Really, these small things are often achieved through international pressure. So I don't ever mean to belittle or undermine the importance or devalue the importance of international pressure. But I think we need to understand its limits. And I think there's no escaping the harder, longer term project of really convincing a majority community that is sometimes hostile to these things, that these things are really important for everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gihan, for that very thorough answer. That brings us to the close of this webinar. I do want to take a moment to thank the speakers who have given up their time, Shireen, Jim, Dr. Gihan, and also to the participants who have given up their time as well to take part. I do want to thank all of you for being so engaging with your questions and for the responses from the speakers. I do want to reiterate that our report is now live and it's available on our website along with our documentary. And I think the link was put in the chat earlier. But thank you so very much. And I do hope that we gain results going forward that will be favorable to those that are struggling and those that are suffering. And from all of us at the People's Rights Group, thank you so much. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Thank you so much.